Let me tell you something that still haunts me in the sweetest way possible. There was a single Sunday morning in Philadelphia, autumn of 1726, when I was 20 years old and completely lost. I sat on the edge of my bed in a boarding house that smelled of old wood and somebody else's coffee, and I made a decision so quiet that nobody heard it, not a single soul. But that whispered choice, made in absolute solitude, became the invisible architecture of everything good that would ever happen in my life. You know what terrifies me? It's not that most people make the wrong loud decisions. It's that they never make the right quiet ones. The ones nobody applauds. The ones that don't show up on anyone's feed. The ones that happen in the space between who you are right now and who you're capable of becoming. I'm Benjamin Franklin, and if you know me at all, you probably know the famous parts. The lightning. The kite. Maybe you've heard I was a founding father, a printer, an inventor, a diplomat. Perhaps you know I'm on the $100 bill, which is ironic because the decision I'm about to share with you had nothing to do with money and everything to do with something money can't buy. But here's what they don't tell you in the history books. Before any of that happened, I was a mess. A spectacular, overconfident, often insufferable mess. I had run away from my apprenticeship with my brother. I had arrived in Philadelphia with exactly $1 in my pocket, walking down Market Street, eating a puffy roll, looking absolutely ridiculous, with 2 more rolls tucked under my arms, because I didn't know any better. A girl named Deborah Reed saw me from her doorway and laughed at how foolish I looked. She would eventually become my wife, but in that moment, I was just another nobody with crumbs on his shirt and dreams bigger than his common sense. I'm not sharing this to be humble. I'm sharing this because you need to understand something crucial. The distance between that confused kid with the rolls and the man who would help birth a nation wasn't filled with luck or genius or connections. It was filled with one quiet decision, repeated over and over and over again. That decision? To become deliberately different from what I was. Not suddenly, not dramatically, not in some explosive moment of transformation that everyone could see, but quietly, privately, in the smallest choices that nobody notices, but that compound like interest in a bank account you didn't know you were building. Stay with me, because what I'm about to share isn't just my story. It's a mirror, and if you're brave enough to look into it honestly, you might see the exact moment your own life is waiting to change. Not someday, right now, in this very ordinary, very precious moment you're living through. You see, most people are waiting for permission to become who they're meant to be. They're waiting for the right time, the right resources, the right encouragement, the right circumstances. But I learned something that cold morning in 1726 that I need you to understand in your bones. The right time is the moment you decide it is. The right resources are whatever you have right now. The right circumstances are the ones you're standing in, even if they're uncomfortable, even if they're not what you imagined, even if they feel impossibly small. That morning I sat on that bed and I wrote something down. Not for publication, not for anyone else to ever see, just for me. I created what I called my plan for self-examination. 13 virtues I wanted to live by. 13 quiet commitments that nobody would ever applaud me for keeping. Because most of the time, nobody would even know. Temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, chastity, humility. Read those words, and they might sound boring, old-fashioned, irrelevant to your modern life with its modern problems. But let me translate what I was really doing. I was making a choice about who got to design my character. Me or my circumstances. Me or my worst impulses. Me or the chaos of a world that would happily shape me into something convenient for everyone else but devastating for my own soul. That's what this is really about. The quiet decision that shapes everything isn't about becoming perfect. It's about becoming intentional. It's about waking up to the fact that you're either designing yourself, or you're being designed by forces that don't love you, don't know you, and don't care what happens to your one precious life. I failed at this, by the way, constantly, spectacularly. I never achieved all 13 virtues, not even close. But the decision to try, the commitment to pay attention, the practice of examining myself each evening and asking, was I better today than yesterday? That changed everything. Not because it made me perfect, but because it made me conscious, awake, responsible for my own becoming. And here's what nobody tells you about making this kind of quiet decision. It doesn't feel powerful in the moment. It feels small, uncertain, maybe even silly. You'll make this choice, and the world won't change. Your phone won't suddenly blow up with congratulations. You won't feel instantly transformed. The sun will rise and set exactly as it did before. But something invisible will have shifted, something real. You'll have planted a seed that nobody can see yet, in soil that you'll tend when nobody's watching, that will eventually grow into a tree strong enough to shelter not just you but everyone you'll ever love. Right now, wherever you are, whatever you're dealing with, you're one quiet decision away from a completely different life. Not someday, right now. And the beautiful, terrifying truth is that only you can make it, not your parents, not your partner, not your boss or your friends or some guru or some perfect future version of yourself, just you. Today, in this imperfect, complicated, absolutely ordinary moment. So let me ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly, even if only to yourself. Who are you becoming? Not who do you want to be, not who you pretend to be, not who you wish you were, but who are you actually becoming, based on the choices you're making right now, today, in the moments when nobody's watching. Because here's what I learned in my 84 years of living. Your life isn't shaped by what you say, or what you intend, or what you dream about late at night. Your life is shaped by what you do repeatedly, by the quiet decisions you make when there's no audience, no pressure, no immediate reward, by who you choose to be when it would be easier to be someone else. That morning in 1726, I chose to become my own project, not in an obsessive way, not in a way that made me insufferable to be around, though I'm sure I had my moments, but in a way that meant I took responsibility for my own character, the way a gardener takes responsibility for a garden, with patience, with attention, with the understanding that growth happens slowly, mostly underground, and always requires more time than you think. And friend, I need you to understand something. I'm not speaking to you from some distant historical pedestal. I'm speaking to you as someone who knows what it feels like to be lost, confused, overwhelmed by your own potential, and terrified by your own weaknesses. I'm speaking to you as someone who made every mistake you can imagine and a few you probably can't. I'm speaking to you as someone who learned, slowly and often painfully, that the most powerful thing you can do in this life isn't to be extraordinary in ways everyone can see. It's to be faithful to the quiet work of becoming someone you can respect when you're alone with yourself. That's the decision. That's the whisper that changes everything. Not, I will be great, but I will be intentional. I will pay attention. I will take responsibility for who I'm becoming, starting right now, with whatever I have, wherever I am. Everything else I ever did, every invention, every piece of wisdom, every contribution to my community and my country, it all grew from that one quiet choice, made in a room that smelled like old wood, on a morning nobody remembers, by a confused young man who simply decided that he would rather design himself than be designed by accident. Now let me tell you how this actually worked, how this quiet decision translated into a life I could be proud of. Not to brag, but to show you the mechanics of transformation. Because principles without practice are just pretty words, and I want to give you something you can actually use. So let me take you back to a moment that changed everything. It was a Tuesday morning in Philadelphia, 1728. I was 22 years old, standing in my print shop at dawn, ink already under my fingernails, when I heard shouting from the street. A merchant I knew, Samuel Keimer. Actually, my former employer, was screaming at a young apprentice. The boy had dropped a box of type, scattered letters everywhere. Keimer's face was purple with rage, veins bulging, fist raised. The boy was maybe 14, trembling, tears streaming down his face. Every instinct told me to intervene, to march out there and tell Keimer exactly what I thought of men who terrorize children. My blood was hot. My jaw was clenched. I was already forming the words, but then I stopped. I stood there in my doorway, hand on the frame, and I asked myself a question that would become my compass for the next 6 decades. What outcome do I actually want here? Did I want to feel righteous? Did I want to humiliate Keimer in public? Or did I want to help that boy? Those are 3 different goals, you see. And here's what nobody tells you about anger: it's a terrible strategist. Anger wants to win the argument. Wisdom wants to win the outcome. So I waited. I let Keimer storm off. Then I walked over to the boy, who was still on his knees, picking up letters from the cobblestones. I didn't say a word. I just knelt and helped him. For maybe 10 minutes, we sorted type in silence. Q with Q, S with S, B with B. Finally, the boy looked at me and said, "Aren't you going to tell me I'm stupid too? Are you stupid?" I asked him. I dropped the whole box. "Were you trying to drop it?" "No, sir. I was hurrying." Mr. Keimer said. "Then you're not stupid," I said. "You're rushed. There's a difference. A stupid man makes the same mistake forever. A rushed man just needs to slow down." The boy's face changed. Something unclenched. "Come work for me," I said. "Half the wages Keimer pays, but you'll actually learn the trade. And if you drop something, we'll pick it up together and figure out why it happened." His name was Thomas. He worked for me for 7 years. Eventually ran his own shop in Boston. We corresponded until he died successful, respected, with apprentices of his own who he treated with dignity. Now, here's my question for you. What if I'd chosen anger that morning? What if I'd let that rage consume me? Screamed at him? Struck him? I'd have been within my rights. He was my apprentice, bound by contract. But here's what rage does. It clouds everything. Makes you stupid. And being stupid is the most expensive luxury in the world. I'd have lost James forever. He'd have grown bitter, resentful, and probably ended up in some tavern, complaining about cruel masters for the rest of his mediocre life. And me? I'd have proven I was exactly what he accused me of being. The satisfaction would have lasted maybe 5 minutes. The consequences? A lifetime. See, anger is like setting yourself on fire and hoping the other person chokes on the smoke. But here's the part nobody tells you about controlling your temper. It's not about suppression. That's a myth, and a dangerous one. You can't just bottle up rage like preserving vegetables for winter. Eventually, the jar explodes, and you've got pickled anger all over everything. No, what I learned is this. You acknowledge the anger. You feel it. Let me be clear, I was furious with James. My hands shook. My jaw clenched so hard I thought I'd crack a tooth. The anger was real and justified. But then, and this is the crucial part, you pause. Just pause. Count to 10 if you must, though I usually needed 20. In that pause, you ask yourself one simple question. What do I actually want here? Did I want to punish James? Sure, that urge was there. But what I actually wanted was respect. I wanted to be heard. I wanted him to understand my perspective. And none of those things, not one, would come from an explosion of rage. So I did something radical. I sat down at my desk, pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, and wrote him a letter. Not a letter I would send, at least not immediately. Just a letter to organize my thoughts, to lay out my case as if I were presenting it to a jury. I wrote down every point of disagreement, every instance where I felt he'd overstepped, every argument I wanted to make in my defense. And you know what happened? As I wrote, my anger transformed. It didn't disappear. Anger that is justified doesn't vanish like morning mist. But it changed shape. It became something I could examine from all angles, something I could hold up to the light and inspect without it burning my hands. By the 3rd page, I realized something crucial. Some of my grievances were entirely justified. My brother had been harsh, unfair even. But others, if I'm being completely honest with myself, others were the wounded pride of a young man who didn't like being corrected, even when the correction was warranted. That letter saved me. Not because I sent it, I didn't. Not in that form, but because it gave my anger a productive outlet. It prevented me from saying things I couldn't take back. It kept me from damaging a relationship that, despite its difficulties, was still valuable to me. I kept that letter for 2 days. I read it again the next morning. When my blood had cooled, I crossed out the petty parts. I softened the language in sections where I'd been needlessly harsh. And then, when I'd refined it into something reasonable, something that spoke to resolution rather than revenge, I showed it to my brother. We didn't magically solve everything that day. We weren't suddenly the perfect partnership. But we talked. Really talked. And in that conversation, with my anger channeled through reason rather than erupting through impulse, we found understanding we'd never had before. This is the power of the pause, the sacred space between provocation and response. In that space lives your dignity, your wisdom, and your ability to be effective rather than merely emotional. The world will give you 1,000 reasons to be angry every single day. People will be thoughtless, cruel, or simply mistaken. And you can choose to be a powder keg always ready to explode at the slightest spark, or you can be something far more powerful. You can be a lighthouse, steady, calm, unfazed by the storm raging around you. The waves crash, the wind howls, but the lighthouse stands firm, its beam cutting through the darkness, guiding others to safety. I learned this lesson painfully in my diplomatic years. I spent nearly a decade in France, negotiating for American independence. Can you imagine the frustration? Dealing with politicians who moved at a glacial pace, with bureaucrats who cared more about protocol than principle, with allies who promised much and delivered little. There were nights I lay awake, my blood boiling at some insult, some broken promise, some petty slight. I could have raged. I could have stormed into those gilded halls and told them exactly what I thought of their delays and their games. But what would that have accomplished? A moment of satisfaction, perhaps, a fleeting sense of having stood up for myself, and the permanent loss of everything we were fighting for. So instead, I smiled. I charmed. I played the simple American sage they expected. I swallowed my anger and transformed it into something useful: patience, strategy, persistence. Every insult became information. Every delay became an opportunity to strengthen other alliances. Every frustration became fuel for more creative diplomacy. And it worked. Not because I was weak, but because I was wise enough to know that winning mattered more than being right in the moment. This is what the angry mob will never understand. They think anger is strength. They think losing your temper shows you care. But I'm telling you, the person who can remain calm when everyone around them is losing their mind, that person holds all the power. Because here's the truth that nobody wants to hear. Your anger doesn't punish the person who wronged you. It punishes you. It floods your body with poison. It clouds your judgment. It makes you stupid when you need to be smart, reckless when you need to be careful. And perhaps worst of all, anger makes you predictable. When someone knows what enrages you, they own you. They can pull your strings like a puppet master. One pointed comment, one calculated insult, and you dance exactly as they intended. I learned this while watching the Continental Congress. There were men, brilliant men, whose anger was their undoing. You could map their rage like the streets of Philadelphia. Mention their honor, and they'd explode. Question their patriotism, and they'd lose all reason. These men never won important debates. They couldn't, because the moment they started shouting, they'd already lost. Their opponents simply had to provoke them, then sit back and watch them destroy their own credibility. Anger is a luxury you cannot afford if you want to shape the world. It's a tool that breaks in your hand and cuts you in the process. Now here's what most people misunderstand. I'm not telling you to never feel anger. That's impossible, and frankly, unhealthy. Anger is a natural response to injustice, to violation, to threat. The question isn't whether you feel it. The question is what you do with it. The fool lets anger use him. The wise man uses anger. When I felt rage, and believe me, I felt it plenty, I didn't suppress it. I transformed it. I channeled it into something productive, into satire that changed minds, into inventions that solved problems, into diplomatic strategies that won allies. There's a famous letter I wrote, supposedly offering advice on choosing a mistress. It's full of bawdy humor and seems frivolous on the surface. But I wrote it when I was furious about the hypocrisy I saw around me. Men preaching virtue while living vice. Society pretending at morals it didn't practice. I could have written an angry screed. I could have shouted my outrage. Instead, I wrote satire so clever that people laughed, passed it around, and, in laughing, actually thought about the contradictions I was exposing. That's anger transformed into power. The same principle applies to every conflict you'll ever face. Your coworker undermines you. Your competitor spreads lies. Someone betrays your trust. In each case, hot anger will drive you toward reactions that feel satisfying in the moment, but leave you weaker in the end. Cold strategy, however, will show you how to turn the situation to your advantage. Let me share with you the anatomy of destructive anger. When someone wrongs you, what actually happens inside your mind? First comes the shock the moment your brain registers the injustice. Then the heat rises. Your heart rate increases. Your thoughts become consumed with the offense. You replay it endlessly, each repetition adding fuel to the flame. You imagine confrontations. You craft clever retorts. You fantasize about revenge. And with each passing minute, you give that person more and more control over your mental state. Here's the uncomfortable truth. While you're burning with rage, the person who wronged you is probably going about their day completely unbothered. You're paying the price for their offense twice, once when they committed it, and continuously as you let it consume you. This is what I discovered during my years navigating the treacherous waters of colonial politics. The men who wronged me didn't suffer from my anger. I did. I learned to ask myself a simple question whenever I felt that heat rising. Will this anger serve me or enslave me? That question became my anchor. Because here's what most people never realize: anger isn't inherently bad. It's a signal, like pain when you touch something hot. The signal warns you. It tells you something needs to change. But if you keep your hand on the hot stove, the warning becomes the wound. Strategic response requires space between stimulus and reaction. In that space lies all your power. When someone attacks your reputation, insults your work, or betrays your trust, they're actually presenting you with a test. Not a test of your strength or your righteous fury, but a test of your discipline. Can you create that space? Can you pause long enough to think rather than just react? I developed a technique I called the 24-hour rule. Whenever I received news that enraged me, I would write my response immediately. Every cutting word, every justified accusation, every devastating counterattack. I would pour all that heat onto paper, and then I would lock it in my drawer. For 24 hours, that letter would sit there, sealed away. The next day, I would read it again with cooler eyes. 9 times out of 10, I would burn the letter. The fury that seemed so righteous by candlelight appeared childish in the morning sun. The insults that demanded a response revealed themselves as words spoken by someone in their own pain. Distance, you see, is the great clarifier. I would write another letter, this time with my faculties intact, and more often than not, I would write nothing at all. Because silence, I learned, is sometimes the most eloquent reply of all. This practice saved me countless friendships. It protected my reputation more times than I can count. And it taught me, perhaps the most valuable lesson about anger that I ever learned. The feeling will pass if you simply give it room to breathe. Your modern world makes this infinitely harder, I know. You carry machines in your pockets that allow you to broadcast your rage to hundreds, thousands, millions of people with a single touch. There is no drawer, no sealed envelope, no enforced waiting period between impulse and action. But the principle remains sound. Create your own drawer. Write your furious message if you must, but save it as a draft. Turn off your screen. Walk away. Give yourself the gift of time between feeling and action. I promise you this: the you of tomorrow will thank the you of today for that small act of restraint. Because words, once released, cannot be recalled. They live forever in the memory of the wounded, long after your anger has faded into embarrassment. The third discipline I imposed upon myself was what I called the practice of contrary thinking. When someone opposed me, particularly if they did so with heat and certainty, I trained myself to pause and consider, what if they are right and I am wrong? This was not natural to me. I was, by disposition, quite certain of my own correctness. I had a quick mind, and it delivered judgments rapidly, often before the other person had finished speaking. I would feel the conclusion forming, feel the certainty settling into my bones, and my mouth would open to correct their evident foolishness. But I noticed something troubling. The more certain I became, the angrier I grew when contradicted. My anger, I realized, was not truly about truth. It was about ego. I was not defending reality. I was defending my image of myself as someone who understood reality. So I began a peculiar exercise. Whenever I felt that burning certainty rising, that absolute conviction that I was right and they were wrong, I would force myself to argue their position in my own mind. Not to agree with them, no, I was still Benjamin Franklin, still convinced of my own correctness, but to understand their position so thoroughly that I could defend it as ably as they might. To see through their eyes, if only for a moment. The first time I attempted this, it felt like torture. A gentleman had criticized one of my publications as inflammatory and reckless. My immediate response was outrage. How dare he question my judgment? But instead of composing a scathing rebuttal, I sat with his criticism. I forced myself to articulate his concerns as he might see them. Perhaps, from his vantage point, my words did seem hasty. Perhaps he feared the social upheaval they might cause. Perhaps he had responsibilities and relationships that would be threatened by the ideas I was spreading. The exercise didn't make me agree with him, but it did something far more valuable. It made me realize that his opposition wasn't rooted in stupidity or malice. It was rooted in a different set of priorities, a different vision of what mattered most. And once I understood that, my anger dissolved. Not into agreement, but into something more useful. Strategic thinking. When you understand why someone opposes you, you can address their actual concerns, rather than the straw man you've constructed in your mind. You can find common ground where you thought none existed. You can persuade rather than bludgeon. But here's what surprised me most about this practice. The more I did it, the more often I discovered I was actually wrong. Not always. Not even usually. If I'm being honest, pride dies hard. But often enough that it shook my confidence in that feeling of certainty I'd relied upon my entire life. I would argue their position in my mind, and halfway through, I would realize, wait, they have a point, a genuine point, something I hadn't considered, some consequence I'd overlooked in my rush to judgment. And in that moment, brief though it was, I felt the satisfaction of genuine discourse, not the hollow victory of winning an argument, but the quiet pleasure of learning something new. This is what we've sacrificed at the altar of speed. This slow unfolding of thought, this patience construction of understanding between two minds. I often think of how we conducted the Constitutional Convention. 4 months we spent in that stifling Philadelphia summer. 4 months of argument, compromise, and revision. There were moments I thought we'd never agree on anything. Moments when tempers flared so hot I feared the whole enterprise might collapse. But we stayed in that room. We couldn't simply log off when the discussion became uncomfortable. We couldn't retreat to separate corners of the internet to nurse our wounded pride and craft the perfect comeback. We had to sit with our disagreements, had to look each other in the eye the next morning and try again. And yes, it was exhausting. Yes, there were days I wanted nothing more than to abandon the whole thing and return to my peaceful retirement. But that friction, that uncomfortable, slow, frustrating friction was precisely what refined our arguments into something worth preserving. The document we produced wasn't perfect. I said as much at the time. But it was thoughtful. It was measured. It bore the marks of genuine deliberation. Can we say the same of our modern discourse? When does an issue trend for 48 hours before we've moved on to the next outrage? When our opinions must fit into character limits designed for observations about breakfast? I've watched this pattern repeat itself endlessly. Some event occurs. Within hours, everyone has formed a complete opinion. Battle lines are drawn. And anyone who says I'm not sure yet or I need to think about this is treated as either a coward or a collaborator. We've created a culture where thinking is seen as hesitation, where nuance is weakness, where the person who speaks first and loudest is valued over the person who speaks carefully and well. And perhaps most troubling, we've convinced ourselves this is progress, that our ability to form instant judgments represents some evolution of human consciousness, that our grandparents were simply slower, less informed, and less capable of processing complexity. I assure you they were not. What they possessed was something far more valuable, the patience to let judgment ripen like fruit on the vine. They understood that truth, like good wine, needs time to breathe. Consider the difference between how we consume news then versus now. When I was young, the evening newspaper was an event. Father would settle into his chair after supper, unfold those great broadsheet pages with a satisfying rustle, and read. Not skim read. He'd pause over an article about Eisenhower's latest policy decision, sometimes reading passages aloud to Mother, inviting her response. "What do you make of this business in Korea?" he'd ask. And they'd discuss it. Not argue their preformed positions, but genuinely explore the question together. The news had traveled slowly enough that by the time it reached our dinner table, the initial shock had worn off. What remained was substance, context. The journalist had time to investigate, the editor had time to verify, and we, the readers, had time to absorb and consider before the next wave of information crashed over us. Now, we're drowning in a flood of headlines, each one screaming for immediate attention, immediate reaction, immediate judgment. We scroll through catastrophes the way we once flipped through vacation postcards. Earthquake, scandal, miracle, outrage, all given equal weight, equal urgency, equal claim on our emotional resources, and we're expected to have an opinion on every single one, instantly, or risk being labeled uninformed. But here's what nobody tells you. You cannot care deeply about everything without caring deeply about nothing. It's a mathematical impossibility. Your capacity for genuine concern is finite as your capacity for genuine joy or genuine love. When you spread it thin across 10,000 daily crises, you're not being compassionate. You're numbing yourself to the very empathy you're trying to demonstrate. This is the great exhaustion of our age. We're tired not because we're doing too much, but because we're feeling too much, too quickly, about too many things we cannot change. And then we judge ourselves for not feeling enough, for scrolling past someone's tragedy to watch a video of a dancing cat, as if this makes us monsters rather than simply human beings trying to survive the fire hose of collective anguish pointed directly at our faces. My grandfather once told me, "Son, you can't carry every burden you encounter. Choose the ones that are yours to carry, and carry them well." This wasn't callousness, it was wisdom. But modern life tells us the opposite. It whispers that if we're not outraged about everything, we're complicit in everything. That peace of mind is a privilege we haven't earned. That joy in the midst of global suffering is a moral failing. This is a recipe for paralysis, not change. I learned this the hard way during a particularly dark news cycle a few years ago. Every morning, I'd wake up and immediately check my phone, scrolling through tragedy after tragedy, conflict after conflict. I'd feel my chest tighten, my breathing shallow. By the time I got to work, I was already depleted, running on fumes of anxiety and secondhand trauma. And here's the thing, I wasn't helping anyone. I wasn't on the ground in disaster zones. I wasn't organizing relief efforts. I was just absorbing pain like a sponge with nowhere to wring it out. I was performing a kind of digital self-flagellation, as if the depth of my distress could somehow balance the scales of cosmic injustice. It took my therapist asking a simple question to break the spell. What would you do differently today if you didn't know about that crisis happening on the other side of the world? The answer was unsettling in its honesty. Probably nothing different at all. The awareness wasn't translating to action. It was just translating to suffering. This isn't to say we should be ignorant or indifferent. But there's a vast difference between informed compassion and compulsive consumption of catastrophe. One leads to meaningful engagement within your sphere of influence. The other leads to burnout, despair, and ultimately, the very numbness we're trying to avoid. We've confused awareness with action, and anxiety with empathy. We think if we just care harder, scroll longer, share more posts, that somehow the collective weight of our digital concern will tip the scales. But caring isn't measured in stress hormones. Real compassion doesn't leave you incapacitated. My grandfather's wisdom echoes here again. Choose the burdens that are yours to carry. Not because other burdens don't matter, but because you're finite. Your capacity is real. Your energy is limited. And a burned-out, anxiety-ridden version of you helps no one, not the causes you care about, not your community, and certainly not yourself. This is where boundaries become an act of radical responsibility, not selfishness. In my own time, I watched philanthropists collapse under the weight of their own generosity. Men who gave to every cause, answered every petition, attended every charitable meeting until their health gave out. Their businesses failed, and they had nothing left to give anyone. Their intentions were noble. Their execution was unsustainable. The same pattern repeats today, just faster. You're expected to respond to messages instantly, support every fundraiser in your feed, show up for every friend in crisis, and maintain perfect moral consistency across every issue that emerges, sometimes multiple times a day. The pace is inhuman. The expectation is impossible. And yet we try. We try because we've been told that hesitation equals apathy, that boundaries equal privilege, that self-preservation equals moral failure. But let me ask you this. Have you ever noticed how the people screaming loudest about everyone else's moral obligations are rarely the ones doing the quiet, sustained work that actually changes things? They're not building institutions, forming coalitions, or showing up week after week for the unglamorous labor of real change. They're performing outrage, demanding immediate action from others, and moving on to the next cause before the last one is resolved. Meanwhile, the people doing actual good in the world, the organizers, the teachers, the community builders, they understand something crucial. Sustainability matters more than intensity. A year of consistent effort beats a week of frantic virtue signaling every single time. I spent decades in public service. I helped found a nation, for heaven's sake. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that the marathon matters more than the sprint. The people who changed Philadelphia weren't the ones who showed up once with grand proclamations. They were the ones who came to every meeting, paid their dues, did the boring administrative work, and stuck around when enthusiasm faded. That kind of commitment requires protecting your energy. It requires knowing when to say yes and when to say no. It requires understanding that you cannot pour from an empty cup, no matter how many people are thirsty. This is where strategic selfishness becomes strategic effectiveness. When you protect your capacity, you actually increase your impact over time. You become more useful, not less. You can sustain effort where others burn out. You can think clearly when others are drowning in exhaustion and resentment. And here's what most people miss. Rest isn't weakness. It's a strategic advantage. The farmer who refuses to rotate his crops will deplete his soil within 3 seasons. The blacksmith who never lets his forge cool will crack the iron. The merchant who sails without ever returning to port will lose his crew to scurvy and mutiny. Your mind and body follow the same laws. I built rest into my daily routine not as an afterthought, but as essential architecture. After intense morning writing, I'd turn to lighter correspondence. After difficult political negotiations, I'd spend an evening with scientific experiments that engaged a different part of my thinking. After weeks of diplomatic pressure in France, I'd retreat to Passy and work with my hands printing, inventing, tinkering with things that had nothing to do with treaties or politics. This wasn't indulgence. It was maintenance of my most valuable asset, my capacity to think clearly and act decisively over decades, not just days. The modern world has made a terrible mistake. It's convinced you that rest is something you earn after productivity, rather than what makes productivity possible in the first place. You don't rest because you've worked hard enough to deserve it. You rest because, without it, the work itself becomes impossible to sustain. I've watched brilliant minds burn themselves out by 25. I've seen promising careers collapse under the weight of chronic exhaustion, masquerading as dedication. I've observed organizations destroy their most talented people by rewarding relentless availability and punishing boundaries. This is not virtue. This is a waste. A candle that burns at both ends produces twice the light for half the time, then leaves you in darkness when you need it most. The goal isn't to burn brighter. It's to burn longer, steadier, and more reliably. Here's the practical application. Schedule your recovery with the same seriousness you schedule your work. For me, this meant specific hours for specific activities. Sunday was not a day to catch up on what I'd missed during the week. It was a day of complete mental rest, conversation with friends, and activities that replenished rather than depleted. My evening hours were protected. No matter how pressing the political crisis or how important the correspondence, I stopped working at a reasonable hour. Not because the work wasn't important, but because my ability to continue doing it well depended on that boundary. I learned to say no. This perhaps was the hardest lesson of all. Every request that came my way seemed worthy. Every cause appeared just. Every person who sought my time had legitimate needs. But I had to accept a fundamental truth. Saying yes to everything meant saying no to the things that mattered most. When asked to serve on yet another committee, I developed the habit of pausing before responding. I would ask myself, does this align with my deepest priorities? Will this matter 5 years from now? Am I the only person who can do this? Or could someone else do it equally well? These questions became my filter, protecting me from the tyranny of the urgent at the expense of the truly important. I remember declining an invitation to join what seemed like a prestigious commission. The person who invited me was offended. He suggested I was shirking my civic duty. But I knew something he did not. I had already committed those same hours to mentoring a young printer who would go on to establish newspapers throughout the colonies. Which was more valuable? The appearance of importance, sitting in rooms with other important men discussing important things, or the quiet work of investing in one person who would amplify ideas of liberty to thousands? I chose the latter. History, I believe, vindicated that choice. The boundaries I established extended beyond my professional life. I maintained my personal relationships with fierce intentionality. Friday evenings were reserved for my Junto Club, where minds met in honest intellectual exchange. Sunday mornings I spent with my family, without exception. These weren't idle hours to be sacrificed when work demanded more. They were the very foundation that made the work possible. Some called me rigid. Others thought my boundaries reflected a lack of commitment. But I observed something curious. Those who worked without limits eventually lost their capacity for the work itself. They burned bright and fast, like poorly constructed fireplaces that consumed all their fuel in a spectacular but brief blaze. I preferred the steady, well-banked fire that could warm a house through the longest winter. Your energy is not infinite. This seems obvious, yet how many of us live as though it were? We spend our resources as if drawing from an endless well, shocked when we eventually hit bedrock. I learned to treat my energy as the precious, limited resource it was. I began by tracking how I spent it, as carefully as I once tracked my expenditures in the ledger. Where did my hours go? What activities left me depleted? And which ones renewed me? The answers surprised me. Social gatherings, which I had always assumed energized me, often left me hollow. Not all of them, but many. The difference, I discovered, was authenticity. When I could speak my mind freely, when conversation went beyond pleasantries into ideas and genuine connection, I left invigorated. But the endless dinners of forced smiles and political maneuvering, they drained me to my core, even as I smiled through them. I realized I had been spending my energy on interest payments, activities that demanded constant renewal but yielded nothing. The contentious meetings, the relationships that took everything and returned nothing. The projects were born from obligation rather than passion. So I began to redirect. I couldn't eliminate every drain. Responsibility demanded certain sacrifices, but I could be more deliberate. I could say no to the invitations that would leave me empty. I could delegate the tasks that others could handle as well as I could. I could protect my mornings, those precious hours when my mind was sharpest, for the work that truly mattered. This wasn't selfishness. This was stewardship. You cannot pour from an empty vessel. You cannot illuminate others if your own flame has gone out. I watched my father work himself into an early grave, and I had sworn I wouldn't follow that path. Yet for years, I was doing exactly that, just in a different fashion. He had depleted himself through physical labor. I was doing it through mental and emotional expenditure. The method differed, but the destination was the same. The turning point came one autumn evening. I had agreed to attend yet another function, one I had no interest in, with people I had no desire to see, discussing matters I had no passion for. As I stood in my study, preparing to leave, I felt such overwhelming exhaustion that I actually sat down, unable to take another step. I stared at my reflection in the darkened window and barely recognized the man looking back. When had I become so hollow? When had my life become a performance I no longer believed in? My wife found me there, and for perhaps the first time in years, I spoke to her with complete honesty. I told her I couldn't continue this way, that something fundamental had to change, or I feared what might break inside me. Her response surprised me. She didn't argue or dismiss my concerns. Instead, she said something that has stayed with me ever since. I've been watching you disappear for months. I just didn't know how to reach you. That conversation became the first of many difficult but necessary discussions. We began examining not just my schedule, but the assumptions underlying every commitment I'd made. Why had I agreed to serve on that board? Because I genuinely cared about the mission, or because someone important had asked? Why was I attending conferences in fields tangential to my expertise? Because they offered real value, or because I enjoyed the ego stroke of being invited? The answers were humbling. So many of my commitments existed not because they mattered, but because they made me feel important. I had confused a full calendar with a meaningful life. The process of untangling myself was neither quick nor easy. When I began declining requests and stepping back from obligations, people noticed. Some understood, many didn't. I received emails expressing disappointment, subtle suggestions that I was letting people down, and even a few pointed comments about commitment and responsibility. Each one triggered that familiar guilt. Each one tempted me to relent, to apologize, to say yes just one more time. But I had learned something crucial. Guilt is often the price of growth. Disappointing others is sometimes necessary to stop disappointing yourself. I started with the easiest cuts, obligations that had always felt peripheral, committees I joined out of politeness rather than passion. Then came the harder decisions. Stepping down from a board I'd served on for years, telling a friend I couldn't co-chair their fundraising event, informing my professional organization that I wouldn't seek re-election to a position many assumed I wanted. Each conversation felt like peeling off a layer of identity I'd worn so long it had begun to feel like skin. And with each one, I waited for the regret to hit. For that voice to say, "What have you done?" It never came. Instead, what I felt was something I hadn't expected. A strange lightness, not the euphoria of freedom, but something quieter. Like setting down luggage I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten it had weight. The reactions were telling. Some people were genuinely supportive. They said things like, "Good for you," or "I've been thinking about doing something similar." Their relief was almost palpable, as if my permission to step back permitted them to at least consider it themselves. But others? The disappointment was real. Not anger, exactly, but a kind of confused hurt. As if my pulling back somehow diminished what we'd built together, or worse, made them question their own commitments. One colleague said to me, "But you're so good at this. Who's going to replace you?" And I realized that question revealed the trap we'd both been living in. The assumption that, because I could do something well, I should keep doing it indefinitely. That competence created an obligation. That excellence was its own prison. I told her the truth. I don't know who will replace me, but I trust that someone will, and they'll probably bring a fresh perspective we desperately need. What I didn't say, but what I was learning, was that nobody is irreplaceable. That's not pessimism, it's liberation. The organizations and causes we care about are bigger than any single person. They have to be, or they're not built to last. Making yourself indispensable isn't service. It's ego dressed up in martyr's clothing. The hardest part wasn't the actual conversations. It was the silence that followed. The calendar gaps where commitments used to be. The evenings, when I'd habitually check my email for the urgent request that didn't come because I was no longer the person they called. I found myself doing something I'd resisted for decades. I started saying no. Not with elaborate explanations or apologetic paragraphs, just, "No, I appreciate you thinking of me, but I can't commit to that right now." Simple, direct, terrifying. The first few times felt like jumping off a cliff. My chest would tighten. I'd hover over the send button, mentally cataloging all the ways this refusal might damage my reputation, burn bridges, and close doors. But then I'd remember what those open doors had cost me. The bridges I'd maintained while the foundation of my own life crumbled. Something unexpected happened. The world didn't end. People didn't hate me. Most simply said, "Understood," and moved on. Some even seemed to respect the boundary more than they'd ever respected my availability. It turned out that being selectively available made my yes mean something. When I did commit, people knew I meant it, that I'd follow through with focus rather than fragmented attention. But here's what nobody warns you about. When you stop filling every moment with urgency, you're left with something profoundly uncomfortable: yourself. The noise stops, and suddenly you're alone with the thoughts you've been outrunning, the questions you've been too busy to ask, the feelings you've been scheduling around. I remember the first Saturday I had nothing planned. Genuinely nothing. No projects, no obligations, no inbox demanding attention. I woke up and felt panic. Actual panic. Who was I if I wasn't doing something? What did I even want to do? I'd spent so long being responsive to external demands that I'd forgotten how to be generative from internal desire. I sat in that discomfort like sitting in ice water, waiting for my body to adjust to the temperature. I made coffee slowly. I read without the pressure of finishing. I took a walk with no destination, no fitness goal, no podcast filling my ears. Just walking. Just being. It felt wasteful and necessary in equal measure. Gradually, something emerged from that space. Curiosity. Actual, genuine curiosity about things that had nothing to do with productivity or advancement. I started noticing birds not in an organized bird-watching way, but just seeing them. The particular blue of a jay. The absurd confidence of a tiny chickadee. I started cooking not to optimize nutrition or save time, but because combining flavors was interesting. These weren't goals. They weren't self-improvement projects. They were just interesting, worth paying attention to, worth doing again. And here's what nobody tells you about that approach. It's sustainable in a way that willpower never is. When you're running on discipline alone, you're spending something finite. You're drawing down an account that empties. Every virtuous choice costs you something. You wake up every morning and face the same battle. Do the thing you don't want to do because you've decided you should want to do it. That works for a while. Sometimes a long while, if you're particularly stubborn. But it's exhausting. It's joyless. And eventually, inevitably, you run out of fight. But curiosity? Curiosity replenishes itself. It doesn't deplete you, it energizes you. When you're genuinely interested in something, engaging with it doesn't cost willpower. It generates it. I didn't have to force myself to go to the gym once I got curious about what my body could actually do. I didn't have to discipline myself to practice an instrument once I got genuinely interested in how music works. The motivation was intrinsic, self-renewing. This is the difference between pushing and being pulled, between obligation and fascination. And the beautiful paradox is this: the people who achieve the most remarkable things rarely start out trying to achieve remarkable things. They start curious. They follow that curiosity consistently, and the achievement is almost a side effect. Darwin wasn't trying to revolutionize biology. He was just really interested in barnacles and finches and earthworms. His notebooks are full of questions, observations, and things he noticed that seemed odd or worth investigating further. Marie Curie didn't set out to win 2 Nobel Prizes. She was fascinated by these mysterious rays that certain materials emitted. She wanted to understand them. The goal-oriented approach asks, what do I want to accomplish? The curiosity approach asks, what do I want to understand? And understanding, it turns out, leads to accomplishment far more reliably than ambition alone ever does. Because when you're curious, you keep showing up, you keep engaging, you keep noticing. And that consistency, that sustained attention over time, that's what creates genuine transformation. Not one heroic effort, not one burst of determination, just coming back, again and again, because you're interested in what happens next. Now, you might be wondering, what would old Ben Franklin do when the interest started to fade, when the novelty wore off? When did the lightning rod experiments become routine? I'll tell you exactly what I did. I changed the question. See, most people think motivation dies because the task gets boring. That's not it. Motivation dies because your relationship times with the task stays the same while you grow past it. When I first started experimenting with electricity, my question was simple. What is this strange force? That question kept me going for months. But eventually, I answered it well enough. And that's when most people would have quit, declared victory, and moved on. But I didn't ask, should I keep going? I asked, what else could this tell me? The question evolved. What is electricity? Became, how does it behave in different conditions? Which became, can we control it? Which became, can we protect buildings from it? Which became, what does this reveal about the nature of matter itself? Each new question was like adding another layer to the game. The core activity stayed the same. I was still playing with electricity. But the times, meaning times of what I was doing, kept expanding. This is the trick nobody tells you. You don't need to stay interested in the same question forever. You need to let the question evolve with times you. Think about it. When you first learned to read, the question was, what do these symbols mean? Then it became, what is this story about? Then, why did the character do that? Then, how did the author create this feeling? Then, what does this reveal about human nature? Same activity, reading. But the question, and therefore your relationship with it, transformed completely at each level. This is how you maintain interest over decades. Not by forcing yourself to care about the same thing in the same way, but by staying curious enough to let your questions deepen. When I look at people who've sustained interest in something for 20, 30, 40 years, master craftsmen, career scientists, lifelong teachers, they're not doing the same thing they were doing on day one. From the outside, maybe it looks identical, but inside their heads, they're exploring territories they couldn't even have imagined when they started. The woodworker isn't just cutting joints anymore. They're having a conversation with the grain, predicting how the wood will move over decades, choosing pieces that will sing together. The teacher isn't just explaining concepts. They're reading the room at a level that borders on telepathy, adjusting their approach for each unique combination of students and circumstances. This cognitive dimension of mastery separates those who merely perform tasks from those who truly understand their domain. And I observed this keenly in my own time. When I set up my printing operation, I didn't just learn to set type. I studied the physics of ink adhesion, the chemistry of paper absorption, and the ergonomics of press operation. I experimented with typeface designs to understand what made text readable versus what merely looked decorative. Every master develops what we might call an internal simulator, a mental model so sophisticated that they can run scenarios in their mind before committing to action. The surgeon visualizes the procedure, anticipating complications before making the first incision. The programmer sees the cascade of logical operations before writing a single line of code. The chef tastes the dish in their imagination, adjusting seasoning mentally before ever reaching for the salt. This mental modeling isn't mystical. It's the fruit of deliberate practice combined with reflective thinking. It's built through thousands of hours asking why and what if, rather than just how. The apprentice learns the recipe. The journeyman perfects the technique. The master understands the principles so deeply that they can improvise entirely new approaches when circumstances demand it. And here's something crucial that modern education often misses. True mastery requires regular encounters with genuine problems, not just exercises. There's a vast difference between the two. An exercise has a known solution and controlled variables. A problem is messy, with multiple possible approaches and no guaranteed outcome. Exercises build skill. Problems build judgment. I spent countless hours on genuine problems: how to organize a lending library in a city that had never seen one, how to establish a postal system across territories with unreliable roads, how to convince skeptics that lightning was electricity without electrocuting myself in the process. These weren't textbook scenarios. They were real challenges with real consequences, and they forged my abilities in ways that safe practice never could. The master doesn't just accumulate knowledge. They develop what I'd call contextual intelligence, the ability to recognize which tool, technique, or approach fits which situation. This kind of intelligence cannot be taught through lectures alone. It develops through what I experienced repeatedly in my printing house: the moment when theory meets messy reality, and you must decide. Right now, with incomplete information and real stakes on the line, you learn not just what works, but when it works, why it works for this situation but not that one, and how to adapt when circumstances shift beneath your feet. I remember a commission we received for printing currency for Pennsylvania. The challenge wasn't just the technical printing, it was preventing counterfeiting, which was rampant and threatened the entire colonial economy. I couldn't simply apply standard printing techniques. I had to innovate under pressure, studying the patterns in leaves and creating nature prints that were nearly impossible to replicate because no two leaves shared identical vein structures. This wasn't knowledge I found in a book. This was intelligence, born from wrestling with a specific, urgent problem where failure would have serious consequences. The master develops an instinct, a feel for their domain that transcends conscious analysis. When you asked me about setting type, I could feel the proper tension in my fingers before I could explain it in words. That bodily knowledge, that intuition refined through 10,000 repetitions, becomes part of who you are. Your hands know before your mind catches up. But here is something crucial that many miss entirely: the master never stops being a student. The moment you believe you have nothing left to learn, you begin the slow decline away from mastery. I was still discovering new techniques in printing when I was 40, still refining my approach to writing when I was 60, still learning about electricity and science when most men would be preparing for their graves. The master's mindset isn't about reaching a destination where learning ends. It is about deepening forever, about finding new layers of subtlety in what you thought you already understood completely. Every year I printed, I discovered some small refinement, some slight adjustment in pressure or timing that improved the quality imperceptibly to others, but significantly to me. This is why I valued the company of other craftsmen, even when their trades differed from mine. The silversmith working metal, the cabinet maker shaping wood, the shipwright calculating angles, each possessed specialized knowledge, yes, but more importantly, each embodied this commitment to perpetual refinement. We spoke different technical languages, yet understood each other perfectly on a deeper level. I remember an afternoon with a clockmaker named Isaiah, a man of perhaps 60 years who still apprenticed himself, in a sense, to the mechanisms he built. "Every clock teaches me something the previous one did not," he told me, his hands steady as they positioned a gear smaller than a lentil. "I have made perhaps 300 timepieces, and I am still learning how temperature affects the brass, how humidity changes the wood casing. This was mastery speaking, not the boastful declaration of having conquered a domain, but the humble acknowledgement of its inexhaustible depth. The same principle applied to my electrical experiments, my studies of ocean currents, and my inquiries into civic improvement. Each field revealed itself as bottomless upon close examination. The more I understood about electricity, the more questions emerged. Each answer birthed 3 new mysteries. Far from frustrating me, this delighted me, for it meant the journey could never grow stale. Too many abandon their pursuits once the initial excitement fades. Once they have achieved basic competency, they mistake the end of novelty for the end of possibility. The master knows differently. The master knows that true depth begins precisely where most people stop, where the work becomes about subtle refinements rather than obvious progress, where advancement measures in degrees rather than leaps. Consider the art of writing itself. Any literate person can form sentences, construct paragraphs. But between basic literacy and true eloquence stretches an ocean. I have written millions of words across my lifetime, yet each essay still challenges me to find the precise phrase, the exact rhythm, the most effective structure. The fundamentals never change, but their application grows endlessly more sophisticated. This is the master's secret. Endless depth exists within finite boundaries. The fourth truth I must share concerns what I call the discipline of selective ignorance. In my era, a learned man could conceivably master most fields of human knowledge. I devoted myself to science, politics, writing, business, diplomacy, and invention with reasonable competence in each domain. Today, such breadth is impossible. The sum of human knowledge doubles at accelerating intervals. No mortal mind can contain even a fraction of what humanity now knows. This creates a peculiar tyranny, the tyranny of infinite options. Young people today face not scarcity of opportunity but overwhelming abundance. Should you study artificial intelligence or biotechnology, marketing or psychology, Eastern philosophy or Western economics? Each path branches into 1,000 more paths, and the fear of choosing wrongly paralyzes more souls than any external obstacle. I learned this principle managing my printing business. The entrepreneur who tries to serve every customer serves none well. I focused my shop on quality almanacs, newspapers, and governmental documents rather than attempting every species of printing. This limitation paradoxically expanded my influence. By becoming the best at specific things, I became sought after for those precise services. The same principle governed my scientific inquiries. I could have scattered my attention across astronomy, botany, geology, and chemistry. Instead, I concentrated my experimental efforts primarily on electricity. This focus allowed me to penetrate deeply enough to make genuine contributions. My kite experiment succeeded not because I was universally brilliant, but because I had devoted sufficient focused hours to understanding electrical phenomena specifically. Your generation must cultivate what I call strategic ignorance, the conscious choice to remain ignorant of certain domains to achieve mastery in others. This is not laziness but wisdom. The person who spends 3 hours daily studying everything superficially will be surpassed by the person who spends those same hours studying one thing profoundly. I observe young people consuming content across dozens of subjects, becoming familiar with everything and an expert in nothing. They mistake exposure for understanding, recognition for mastery. True expertise requires what your age calls deep work sustained, undistracted engagement with challenging material that pushes your cognitive boundaries. The path to mastery has not changed since my era, it has merely become obscured by the illusion of efficiency. I spent years perfecting my printing craft, not by reading about printing, but by setting type until my fingers moved without conscious thought. I learned French not through an application that gamified vocabulary, but by laboriously translating texts word by word, wrestling with grammar, until the language revealed its underlying architecture. Your modern learners often approach education as consumers rather than practitioners. They watch videos about playing guitar rather than enduring the pain of building calluses. They read summaries of great books rather than grappling with difficult passages that require rereading. They believe they are learning when they are merely being entertained by the performance of knowledge. I am struck by how your society has pathologized boredom, treating it as a condition to be immediately remedied rather than a threshold to deeper engagement. The most profound insights of my life emerged not during moments of stimulation, But during long periods of apparent tedium, the hours spent at the printing press, the quiet evenings of solitary reading, the weeks at sea with nothing but my thoughts and observations, boredom is not the enemy of learning, it is the gateway. It is the mind's signal that superficial engagement has been exhausted and that deeper territory awaits exploration. When you eliminate boredom through constant stimulation, you eliminate the very discomfort that drives genuine curiosity. I observe your young people unable to sit through a university lecture without checking their devices, unable to read a single chapter without interruption, unable to engage in conversation without glancing at screens. This is not a moral failing. It is a predictable adaptation to an environment that has trained their nervous systems to expect novelty every few seconds. The solution is not sophisticated, it is difficult. It requires the deliberate reconstruction of attention through practice. Begin with small durations of undivided focus and gradually extend them. Read physical books without your phone nearby. Write by hand without digital interruption. Engage in conversations without the escape route of screens. These periods of forced discomfort with boredom become training grounds for mental endurance. You discover that the restlessness eventually subsides, replaced by something more substantial: genuine thought, authentic creativity, actual presence. I've watched this transformation in countless individuals. A programmer who deleted all social media from his phone for 30 days initially felt phantom vibrations constantly. By week 2, he reported his mind felt less noisy. By week 4, he'd solved a coding problem that had plagued him for months. The solution came not during focused work, but during a long walk where he simply let his mind wander without a podcast or distraction. The modern addiction to distraction isn't weakness, it's biology exploited by technology far more sophisticated than our evolutionary defenses. But awareness itself becomes a shield. When you understand that every element of these platforms was engineered to capture and monetize your attention, you reclaim agency. Consider implementing what I call friction by design. Make the things you want to do less of slightly more difficult, and the things you want to do more of slightly easier. Want to read more? Keep books in every room where you typically scroll. Want to scroll less? Log out of all apps after each use, requiring deliberate choice to re-engage rather than reflexive habit. The goal isn't digital monasticism for most people. It's intentionality. It's designing your technological environment rather than being designed by it. I often think of a conversation with a woman in her 70s who described growing up before television was common. "We had to make our own entertainment," she said, "and I was never bored. Now I have infinite entertainment options, and I'm bored constantly." She'd identified the paradox: perfectly abundance of stimulation creates poverty of engagement. Your life is happening in the unrecorded moments. The conversation where no clever comment needs to be crafted for public consumption. The sunset was watched simply because it was beautiful, not because it would make compelling content. The achievement is pursued for its own satisfaction, rather than the validation it might generate. This might be the most radical act available in modern culture. To live substantially in the world that exists beyond screens. To find your worth in what you create and contribute, rather than how you're perceived. To build a self that doesn't require constant external validation to feel real. The liberation waiting on the other side of this addiction isn't emptiness, it's presence. Not loneliness, but solitude rich with self-knowledge. The social media companies understand something profound about human psychology. We are wired to seek social information the way our ancestors sought food and shelter. In the ancestral environment, knowing your social standing, understanding group dynamics, and maintaining relationships were literally matters of survival. Being excluded from the tribe could mean death. These platforms have weaponized that ancient circuitry. Every notification triggers the same neural pathways that once alerted us to potential threats or opportunities in our social environment. Every like activates reward centers that evolved to reinforce behaviors that increased our chances of survival and reproduction. But here's what they're counting on you not to realize. The social information you're consuming is not real social information. It's a simulacrum, a shadow play that mimics genuine human connection while delivering none of its actual benefits. Studies on this are unequivocal. Time spent on social media does not correlate with increased feelings of connection or decreased loneliness. In fact, the correlation runs in the opposite direction. The more time people spend on these platforms, the more isolated and disconnected they report feeling. It's junk food for the social brain, engineered to trigger cravings while providing no actual nourishment. Consider what happens during an actual face-to-face conversation with a friend. You're reading micro-expressions, vocal tone, and body language. You're engaged in a dynamic exchange where meaning is co-created in real time. There's vulnerability, presence, the possibility of genuine surprise, and discovery. You are fully seen, and you fully see another person. Now consider the pale imitation offered by social media. You craft a message carefully, perhaps revising it multiple times, presenting a curated version of a thought. It's received asynchronously, in a context you cannot control, often while the recipient is simultaneously engaged in 3 other conversations. The response, if it comes, is similarly mediated and managed. Nothing is spontaneous. Everything is performance. This is not a connection. It's the digital equivalent of writing letters to someone in the same room rather than simply speaking to them. We've convinced ourselves it counts as social interaction in the same way that watching cooking shows might feel like we're learning to cook. There's a superficial similarity that masks a profound difference. The practical implications are staggering. An entire generation is entering adulthood, having spent their formative years practicing this simulacrum of connection, instead of developing actual social skills. They're entering workplaces where success depends on reading subtle cues in meetings, building genuine rapport with colleagues, and navigating the unspoken dynamics of office politics, skills you cannot develop through screens. They're forming romantic partnerships without ever having learned how to have difficult conversations face-to-face, how to read their partner's mood from body language alone, how to sit with uncomfortable silence rather than immediately reaching for a device. The cognitive dissonance is breathtaking. We've built a society that simultaneously demands unprecedented levels of emotional intelligence while systematically eliminating the conditions necessary to develop it. It's like requiring everyone to be Olympic swimmers while draining all the pools. We're confused about why people are struggling with something we've made functionally impossible to practice. And here's what troubles me most profoundly. We're not just losing skills, we're losing the very capacity to recognize what we've lost. When you've never experienced genuine, sustained, undivided human attention, you don't know what you're missing. When your entire social baseline was established in an environment of constant partial attention and curated personas, you have no reference point for what a deeper connection even feels like. It's the perfect crime in a sense, the theft of something so fundamental that its absence becomes invisible. You can measure declining literacy rates or mathematical competency, but how do you quantify the loss of something as ineffable as the ability to truly be present with another human being? How do you even explain what's missing to someone who's never experienced its presence? I watch young people describe their closest friendships, and I hear language borrowed from workplace relationships, networking, maintaining connections, staying in touch. The very vocabulary reveals the transformation. Friendship has become something you manage rather than something you inhabit, a series of transactions and updates rather than a shared journey through time. The economic system, of course, is perfectly happy with this arrangement. Atomized individuals make better consumers than tight-knit communities. People without deep social bonds spend more money trying to fill the void on entertainment, on purchases, on experiences specifically designed to be photographed rather than lived. We've created the perfect market conditions: maximum loneliness, maximum consumption, minimum awareness that an alternative ever existed. But here's what troubles me most. We've convinced ourselves this represents progress. We call it freedom. We call it choice. We've mistaken the absence of obligations for the presence of liberty. I understood freedom differently. Freedom wasn't isolation, it was the power that came from collective action, from communities that could stand together against tyranny, from social bonds strong enough to support risk-taking and innovation. The young printer who arrived in Philadelphia with nothing in his pockets didn't succeed alone. I succeeded because I could join the junto. After all, I could form partnerships. After all, there was a social fabric that caught people when they fell and lifted them when they climbed. The self-made man was always a myth. Behind every success stood a community, a network, a web of mutual obligation and support. You've replaced that web with a platform. You've substituted the messy, complicated, beautiful work of building real relationships with the frictionless efficiency of clicking connect. And you wonder why you feel so desperately alone. I watch young people spending their evenings in the same room, each staring at a different screen. I watch families at dinner, each absorbed in a separate digital world. I watch crowds of people gathered in the same physical space, experiencing it only through their phone cameras, more concerned with documenting the moment than living it. You're together and alone simultaneously, a psychological state that would have been incomprehensible to previous generations. The technology companies claim they're bringing people together, that they're solving loneliness, that they're building community. But their business model depends on the opposite. They need you isolated, anxious, and endlessly scrolling. They need you to compare your life to others' highlight reels. They need you feeling just inadequate enough to keep seeking validation, just lonely enough to keep checking for notifications, just empty enough to keep consuming. Because here's what I learned in those silent decades in that hall. Real fulfillment comes from building something that outlasts your hunger for approval. Every night, I'd watch visitors shuffle past me, eyes glued to their phones even as they stood before artifacts of human achievement. They were there, but they weren't present. They were so busy capturing the moment for people who weren't there that they missed the experience themselves. And I'd think about my own life, how the printing press gave me independence, how the experiments gave me purpose, how the civic projects gave me meaning. None of it required an audience of thousands. None of it needed instant feedback. The satisfaction came from the work itself, from seeing tangible results, from knowing I contributed something real. You want to know what true freedom feels like? It's closing the app and opening a book. It's having a conversation where nobody reaches for their phone. It's creating something, anything, without immediately wondering how many likes it will get. It's measuring your day by what you built, not by how many notifications you received. The attention economy has convinced you that being seen is the same as being valued. That visibility equals worth. That if you're not constantly broadcasting your existence, you might as well not exist at all. But that's the final lie, and it might be the most destructive one. Because the truth is, the most meaningful parts of life happen in the moments between posts, in the quiet conversations that never make it online, in the small acts of kindness that no camera captures, in the personal growth that has no metric, no dashboard, and no analytics to track. I learned more in one honest conversation at my printing shop than I could have from 1,000 shallow interactions optimized for engagement. I found more satisfaction in one successful experiment than I could have from 1,000,000 hearts and thumbs ups. I built more lasting relationships around one dinner table than any algorithm could ever facilitate. The attention merchants want you to believe that connection happens through screens. But real connection, the kind that actually nourishes your soul, requires presence, vulnerability, time, things that can't be monetized, can't be scaled, can't be optimized. So here's what I'd do if I were you. I'd start by reclaiming 1 hour a day. Just one. Not for productivity, not for self-improvement, just for being fully present in your actual life. This single hour becomes your anchor in the storm of modern life. Maybe it's the first hour after you wake up, before the world makes its demands. Maybe it's the twilight hour, when day surrenders to night. The specific time matters less than the commitment to protect it fiercely. What would you do with this reclaimed hour? Here's what I've observed works. You wouldn't fill it with another task. You'd use it to remember what it feels like to be human rather than productive. To sit with your coffee and actually taste it. To watch how light changes across your room. To have a conversation where you're not simultaneously checking your phone or planning your response. This isn't about adding another item to your wellness checklist. It's about creating a daily reminder that you exist beyond your utility, beyond your output, beyond what you can produce or consume. From this single hour, something unexpected happens. You start noticing other moments throughout your day where you've been sleepwalking. That commute where you're always angry about traffic, what if you actually looked at the world passing by? Those meals you inhale while working, what if you ate them like someone who values their own nourishment? Those interactions with people you love, what if you were actually there for them instead of distracted by the phantom vibration of notifications that never came? The resistance you'll feel to this simple practice will tell you everything you need to know about how deeply the urgency addiction has taken root. Your mind will immediately generate 17 reasons why you can't possibly spare 1 hour, why today isn't the right day to start. You'll begin next week, after this current crisis passes. But here's what I learned in my years. The crisis never passes. There's always another deadline, another emergency, another legitimate reason to defer your own life. The willingness to begin anyway, to claim that hour despite every rational objection, is itself the beginning of freedom. And gradually, that hour teaches you to recognize all the other ways you've surrendered your sovereignty. How have you let other people's emergencies define your priorities? How you've mistaken motion for meaning, How you've traded the deep satisfaction of a few things done with presence for the hollow achievement of many things done while absent. And here's what makes it even more insidious. This cultural conditioning runs so deep that when you finally do slow down, when you finally do choose less, you're met with resistance, not just from the world, but from yourself. Your own mind becomes the prosecutor. Who do you think you are to say no? Who are you to disappoint people? Who are you to have boundaries when everyone else is hustling? I've watched this play out in countless lives. The entrepreneur who finally decides to stop taking every client, every speaking engagement, every networking opportunity and immediately feels like a fraud. The professional who leaves work at a reasonable hour and spends the evening battling guilt instead of enjoying her family. The creative who chooses one meaningful project over 3 mediocre ones and can't shake the feeling that he's lazy, uncommitted, falling behind. This is the final frontier of busyness addiction. The internal battle that rages even after you've made the right choice. And let me be clear about something. This guilt is not wisdom. This anxiety is not ambition. This restlessness is not driven. It's withdrawal. You've been conditioned to find your worth in constant motion, and when you stop moving, even briefly, your nervous system doesn't recognize rest, it registers failure. But here's the truth that will set you free. That discomfort is not a sign that you're doing something wrong. It's a sign that you're doing something right. Every time you feel that pull to add more, to say yes when you should say no, to fill the space instead of honoring it and you resist, you're breaking the pattern. You're rewriting the code. You're teaching yourself a new language of worth. The language that says, I am enough without the performance. My value is not measured in outputs. My life is not a productivity contest. And here's what begins to happen when you truly internalize this. When you move beyond intellectual agreement into embodied practice, you start to notice space where there was only static before. You start to notice space where there was only static before. You walk through your morning without the nagging voice tallying every moment. You spend 20 minutes drinking coffee and looking out the window, and instead of guilt, there's just the warmth of the cup in your hands, the sound of birds, the slow shift of light across the floor. This isn't laziness. This is reclamation. You begin to make choices from a different center. Not what will get me ahead, but what feels true. Not what will others think, but what do I actually need right now, in this moment, in this body, with this one precious life? And here's what's wild, what nobody tells you about stepping off the treadmill. You don't lose your ability to work. You don't become some passive blob. If anything, the opposite happens. When you stop working from depletion, from fear, from the desperate need to prove yourself, when you start working from wholeness, from choice, from genuine interest, your work becomes better, clearer, more impactful. Because you're no longer scattering your energy across 1,000 directions trying to be everything. You're focusing on what actually matters to you. You're saying no to the noise so you can say yes to the signal. You're creating from presence instead of panic. And maybe most importantly, you stop measuring your days by what you accomplished and start measuring them by how you felt, by the quality of your attention, by the depth of your connections. Whether you laughed, whether you were kind to yourself, whether you remembered, even for a moment, that you are more than your output, that you always were, that you always will be. So here's my invitation to you, right now, wherever you are. Stop, just for a moment. Put your hand on your chest. Feel your heartbeat. Notice your breath. This right here, this is what's real. Not your to-do list, not your follower count, not your bank balance, or your job title, or how many hours you worked this week. This aliveness, this consciousness, this miracle of being here, now, aware. You are already whole. You were never broken, and you don't need to earn your existence. Welcome home.